Karma has historically been known as a champion that carries exceptional lane dominance in the early game while carrying some of the best traits of other enchanters so that she can allow her teammates to flourish in later stages. However, there has been one build that many people have been asking me about that gives Karma an alternative identity, one that completely cranks her early game dominance and enables her to become a solo carry beast in the right situation. This is Bezos Karma, which allows Karma to fill a role in team compositions where she normally wouldn't have that capability. This enables a playstyle of Karma that is super underutilized and can honestly create more unique possibilities of team compositions that revolve around. Here's a quick breakdown of how we'll be going over the video. I'll touch on general concepts of this build, identifying times to go for the Bezos Karma build versus a standard build, why it's good, places in which it's good and bad, how this affects your playstyle as Karma, and even how it slots into drafts. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and sub for more content like this. Before we get into details, let's discuss big picture what the build is about. Bezos Karma is all about being greedy and focusing on yourself, essentially becoming a 2022 version of AP Karma. This allows Karma to have a ton of self-agency and power in many situations, creates incredibly strong poke scenarios for her to thrive. It can actually be extremely useful in the right draft. So let's talk about the build itself. What changes about the build that makes it so different? Let's start with the main change, which is the runes. One of the biggest drivers in this build is in its keystone, being First Strike. Karma's kit, an early playstyle, allows her to get a ton of free damage in lane, which makes this rune a very natural fit into her kit. You get a very similar amount of damage output when compared to Arcane Comet, which is her normal keystone, and this enables her to gain access to a disgusting amount of economy that isn't normally possible with support champions. This can be paralleled somewhat to the style of support Xerath, which also takes First Strike as his keystone. To follow with this keystone, Karma typically goes some very greedy runes that are typically uncharacteristic of support champions. Magical Footwear, Biscuits, and Cosmic Insight are all the most common options that I would opt for. Each slot here also has some variants. Free Stopwatch also works with this build since boots are typically so important in the early game in support. However, I don't typically opt for it because this build is actually centered around being economically efficient, and the free boots will give a more direct source of gold generation against something like a Stopwatch, which can only typically build into Zhonya's. In the third row of inspiration, a great alternative to free Biscuits is to go Futures Market, which can help enable Karma's pivotal points. Since First Strike feeds off of the damage that you're able to deal throughout the game, being able to upfront some of your important damage items generates a positive feedback loop there. This lets you deal more damage, generate a stronger mid-game spike, and then the increased damage output from First Strike gives you more gold to play with and allows the Futures Market to pay itself off. In the last tree, a great alternative to Cosmic Insight is actually opting into Approach Velocity. This actually increases her kill threat pretty significantly in some situations, and she will technically always be able to proc it since her Q is always a slow. Sample combos in this case would be to lead with the Q onto an enemy, then use that increased movement speed to gap close while you use your W tether. So if you're in a matchup where you need more kill threat or more survivability in certain situations, you have the freedom to do so in your primary page. In your secondary tree, you also have a couple of options. Cheap Shot and Zombie Ward make for an excellent rounded kit. A similar version of this is to opt for Sorcery, going Transcendence and Scorch or Gathering Storm. A big reason to build her runes the way they are is so that she can supplement her build, which is one of the defining features of Bezos Karma. Although you can still succeed on this build with the standard Karma item set, you will likely see the highest level of success by building damage. This throws out typical support economics out the window since you'll literally be building things that normal carries will build. But this ties again into the parallels of other high econ support champions like Xerath or Vel'Koz, but trades the range for more oomph. For mythics, you'll typically actually opt more into the Lost Chapter family of items because it will give you the amount of damage you need. Thanks to her incredibly high base damages, Bezos Karma sees the most success in situations where you can build Ludens, but Leandries can also be decent in certain situations. After your mythic item, you can basically index into as much magic penetration as possible. So items like Shadow Flame and Dark Seal are your best friend here. Sorc Shoes will almost always be your boot choice to also complement being able to maximize First Strike's viability here. This combination of items essentially translates into a much more defined version of Karma's strengths. You can of course still opt for a more standard Karma build, but for the best results in an environment like solo queue, being able to have this level of damage will likely be ideal. Now let's talk situations in which this build might be more or less optimal to run. Although I'd say that on paper, that Karma can switch her build based on the enemy's team composition, there's relatively specific compositions that rely heavily on enchanters or a backwards fighting style. There's relatively specific situations in which the Bezos Karma build can thrive, and that's generally against compositions that rely heavily on enchanters or a backwards fighting style. Of course, the build will be decently effective in other comps, but I'd say at that point, you may as well pick a different champion to fill that role instead. Bezos Karma adapts a lane dominant, poke heavy composition that is meant to completely punish other backwards comps in the meta right now. If the enemy team has a ton of frontline that can absorb this poke, you should instead transition the build into more of a standard Karma build. But again, this somewhat defeats the identity of the build. The build also slots extremely well as a flexible pick into comps that are generally lacking a source of magic damage overall. Karma as a support champion is actually able to fill that gap really well with her base damages, and these situations allow her to get away with building so much magic penetration in the build. Another example of this being effective is in comps in solo queue where you have a lot of lethality reliant champions on your team. Because this generally incentivizes the enemy to build a ton of armor, you essentially guarantee yourself a decent amount of damage, in most cases dealing true damage. In terms of playstyle, this also allows you to play even more aggressively than normal, it converts Karma into more of a poke mage. You somewhat forfeit your defensive tools like your Mantra Shield and invest most of your power into maximizing your mid-game spike. This in turn should increase the value on things like your shield anyway, because this feeds into the positive feedback loop of the first strike goal generation, which increases your AP, which then in turn allows you to have more significant shielding and so on. In draft, this help feeds into Karma flexibility as a strong blind pick champion, as she already has a very good matchup spread overall. Flexibility in draft has multiple dimensions. You might also be familiar with champions being able to flex their roles, but being able to flex playstyles is also a great asset. There's classic examples of this with champions like Varus or Xayah that previously had great playstyles that allowed them to be flexible and work both in front to back scenarios, but also in longer range poke compositions if required. The Karma build has a similar mindset in this case because it simply increases the amount of compositions your team can opt for overall. Although I described this build from the perspective of support, I'm sure this would work just as well for Karma mid as well, and even Karma top in some matchups. Having priority and being able to support your teammates in a lot of situations in the early game is just very desirable overall, and Karma's kit can complement this extremely well. Overall, this build is one that completely redefines how Karma is played and provides a brand new, rewarding avenue for players to express their skills on this champion. As always, hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next one. Stay fresh.